Okay, it's been a couple of weeks since I've had an opportunity to do one of these, and I came across this article about working the third step, and of course it's on an AA site, and I'll put the link to it in the video description at the bottom. But the first thing I saw, the subheading of the article line was abandon our failed ego-driven insanity. Yeah, ego is just terrible. If you're in AA, you can't have a healthy sense of ego. You can't have a healthy sense of self. You can't practice anything that might give you independent thought or the ability to do things on your own. Because you're an alcoholic, you can't run your own life. We now have to run it. And your ego is terrible. Anytime it's your ego, which used to crack me up because the most egotistical people I ever saw in AA were the people that were like the gurus and the gods that had been there forever and ever that were called on every meeting. Or just in general, AA members. AA members were a very arrogant, egotistical lot, but our ego-driven insanity. Oh, that's right. There's a part in the big book where you line your will up with the will of God. And I remember a lot of AA people would actually arrogantly assume that they could do that. So I'll just jump right in. It says, I don't believe that any two people in the AA program have settled into a concept of a higher power that are identical in every respect. Oh, yeah, they have. If they have any longevity in AA, they have. I mean, AA's underlying message is pretty much the same in every share if you'd been there for a very long time. Yeah, for example, have you ever seen an old timer who's respected and called on every meeting to talk that says, you know something, I've been sober for 25 years, but there were a couple of those steps that I didn't care about, and I just didn't do them. Have you ever seen anybody, have you ever seen anybody share in a meeting? I looked at the idea of making amends to people that I had done wrong, and I've done that before in the past, though. Anytime I did somebody wrong, I did make it right. So I don't have to do the 8-step. You ever heard anybody say that in an AA meeting if they were called on a lot? You ever heard anybody in an AA meeting that gets called on a lot say, I didn't really trust anybody to do the 5th step with, so I just didn't do it. Some things I can keep to myself. You won't hear it. You won't hear that among the people who are called on all the time. You hear the same exact message over and over again. And that's why when I talk about God in these videos, I'm not talking about other people's religions or faiths or whatever. I'm talking about AA God. See, AA God will do everything for you so long as you don't drink. I mean, you can steal from newcomers. You can exploit your sponsees. You can treat people like garbage. You can say things like some have to die so that others can live. But if you don't drink, you're fine. You got a free pass to everything, right? So yeah, everybody in AA pretty much has the same exact ideal when it boils right down to it. I've never seen anybody in AA that was respected and called on a lot say, some things in my religion kind of contradict what's being said in here, and that's one aspect of the program I don't agree with, and I don't do it. You'll never hear anybody in AA who's been there a long, long time say things like that. Okay. Alcoholics, they claim, have been off the grid for such a long time that their concept of everything must be recalibrated into some form of strategy that can work with whether or not anybody else understands the linguistics they use to describe it. All right, you just got through saying everybody doesn't have the same idea in AA, that every concept is going to be different. Now you're saying that because you're an alcoholic, you've been off the grid. I don't get that. For so long that everything has to be recalibrated into something that works, and that everyone won't understand the linguistics. That's a telltale sign, by the way, of a religious cult. By the way, nobody else understands it but us. I used to see people say if you showed the big book to a non-alcoholic, it wouldn't make no sense to them because they're not an alcoholic. So people who drink alcohol exist in a separate universe, with a separate set of laws, with a separate set of reality that doesn't apply to the real world. It just applies to them. That sounds more like a religious cult than anything else. I mean, do you know of anybody that claims there's a book that changed my life, but if you read it, you won't understand it because you're not like me? I've never heard of that. So anyway, the taking of step 3 is deciding to abandon our failed ego-driven insanity and to find another source of principles and behaviors to replace them. Principles and behaviors, let me guess, they're all AA principles and behaviors, right? Like a person didn't have any principles when they were drinking, or a person didn't have any principles when they were an alcoholic. I used to see it in AA all the time. They make alcoholics out to be the worst people on earth, just because they drank. And they assume everybody, is uniform somehow or the other for the reasons why they drank. Where is it? What is that in the 12 and 12? We never tried to be a friend among friends and never was a worker among workers, which I know for a fact in my case is bullshit, because you can contact every single job I've ever had, the companies that are still open and didn't close, resulting in layoffs, and they'll all give me a good reference for being one hard worker. So don't give me that bullshit. But, there again, Alcoholics Anonymous wants to say they want to remove the stigma of alcoholism, but in reality, they perpetuate it. I mean, they make everybody out to be the worst human being on earth before they got to AA, just because they drank, or because, they do drugs, or whatever it is. That does not mean that you're automatically like a murderer, a rapist, a thief, and a liar, and a con artist, and all this other shit they try to paint you a picture of. And then there's this question, why do I need to... who says it's ego-driven insanity that's causing all of this? And then they go on to say they get an uncomfortable feeling at a meeting when it starts going overly religious. All AA meetings are overly religious. They just, they're not religious towards a denomination or towards a sect or anything like that, because AA has its own God. AA God, will let you exploit newcomers, treat sponsees something terrible, lie to people, cheat people, and do all the things that I've seen old timers do. But as long as you don't take a drink, AA God's on your side. You get a free pass. So I was the one described in step 2 in the 12 and 12 that tried religion and found it wanting, they write. Had I not read that line in the 12 and 12, I might not have stayed with the program. Did you read that line in the 12 and 12 where it describes the people who won't believe as belligerent savages? I'm not even an atheist, but anybody reading that would just have to say this is ludicrous what they're saying here. Or the people that are the part where it says those who tried religion and found it wanting, it was just because they were selfish and they just wanted God to do things for them, and that's why they couldn't. That's why they let religion go. They threw the baby out with the bathwater, more or less. They just abandoned religion because they weren't getting what they want. In other words, there's no real logical reason for someone to try religion and find it wanting, as they're calling it. There's no logical reason for anybody to say whatever religion you were brought up with, to question it and say, I just don't believe like this, and I'm going to look elsewhere. They pretty much make everybody out to be like some really severely mentally ill, filled with hate kind of human being in order to not be faith, have all this faith. So, in other words, did you agree with those parts? I mean, do you agree with the part in the 12 and 12 where it paints that ugly picture? Do you agree with Dr. Bob in his Nightmare chapter where he says, if you're atheist and agnostic, I just feel sorry for you? Or do you agree with what Bill W. said, few men are really atheists because those people believe something came from nothing, or whatever it is he says in his story there? Had I not read that line in the 12 and 12, I might not have stayed with the program. So you just took one little line and ignored the rest. I'm kind of wondering how you did that, considering they read that stuff incessantly over and over again. But then he goes on to say, having the option to come to terms with this issue has opened the gate to a path which has worked for me. Let me guess, it's the 12 steps, it's meetings, it's a sponsor, it's the so-called spiritual principles they're always talking about in meeting, but they're so ambiguous they can never describe them. Or they'll talk about, being honest, and I've never seen anybody that was an AA long-timer that was, like an AA celebrity or anything, practice anything remotely close to honest. They'll talk about open-mindedness. Open-mindedness just means open-mindedness for AA stuff. It doesn't mean you could be possibly open-minded about smart recovery or rational recovery or something critical of AA. You can't be open-minded about those things. Open-minded just means open-minded for more AA stuff. So this is the principles we're talking about here. And then he goes on to say, when I simply combined the line on page 27 where it says, you can, if you wish, make AA itself your higher power. I've never really quite understood how do you do a 3rd-step prayer if AA is your higher power? How do you do a 7th-step prayer if AA is your higher power? How do you do a serenity prayer to God if AA is your higher power? How do you say the Lord's Prayer at the end of every meeting if AA is your higher power? How do you do the whole entire part of in the 8th step where it says when we see this working with others, we had to stop doubting God? Did you stop doubting AA group? Is that what you're saying? I mean, how does that work exactly? A whole group of people that you don't even know that are saying all this stuff, that you trust them to somehow keep you from drinking? I mean, exactly how does that work? I've never really quite gotten how you make a group of people a god or something like that. Because the big book over and over again says God. It doesn't say anything you want it to be or higher power. It starts out with a higher power somewhere in the beginning, but then pretty much as you work along, it's pretty much God, 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 and it's AA God. It's not whatever, you know. Or how about the part in the big book where it says, we'll know God and call him by name? I mean, how do you do that when the AA group is your higher power? But then he goes on to say, when I addressed it in that way, I had no problem moving on with the rest of the steps of the program. Well, I mean, the rest of the steps of the program, have you really read 6 and 7? Have you really looked, well, 12? You know, you've had a spiritual awakening. I mean, how does it work when the group is your higher power? How do you carry the message? Or are you saying you started out as the group is your higher power and you did like all the rest of the people that, you know, have been in A long time? You came to know God. How do you practice step 11, by the way, if the group is your higher power? I'm just kind of curious, you know. I've never wanted a drink since I entered the program, and the only answer I could come up with was the influence of AA in my life. AA had an influence in your life, but you quit drinking, okay? And what about all the people that AA doesn't work for? What are you going to say about that? Are you going to just do what most AA members do? You're going to say, well, I don't know about them. Or are you going to say something like, well, they just weren't honest. Or they didn't really want it bad enough. Or whatever. You know, there's always an excuse for the people when it doesn't work. When it works, AA did it. You know, AA takes all the credit. When it doesn't work, you know, that's your fault. You know, you were selfish. You weren't honest. You weren't willing. You weren't ready. You know, to look at yourself and be honest with yourself. You were arrogant and refused to believe in God. You were a belligerent savage, as it says in the 12 and 12. I just wonder, you know, what do you say to all the people that it doesn't work for the 95% or the 94% or whichever number you want to choose from on that? Then he goes on to say, for a guy who couldn't conceive of a day without alcohol to a guy that's never wanted a drink since was all I needed to know about God. Okay, well, for a guy like me that used to couldn't conceive of a day without alcohol, and for a guy like me that doesn't want to drink any alcohol at all, it taught me all I need to know about addiction. It's kind of strange how after a little while when I realized that it's not so bad to get out of bed in the morning when you haven't got a violent hangover and shaking and reaching for a bottle, when you're not kind of physically sick all the time, when you are actually able to be in control of your own behavior and your own emotions, when you can go out in public and not have to worry about a public intox, when you can get behind, knock something over, when you can get behind the wheel of a car and not worry about a DUI, when you don't have to worry about alienating people and upsetting them because of some drunken shenanigans you got up to, and you look around one morning and you say, you know something, I kind of like life without the alcohol, and you know what, I don't want to go back and drink any more alcohol. Doesn't have nothing to do with AA or religion or anything else. And again, what are you going to say to all the people who try AA and fail? You said it taught you all you needed to know about God, but what about everybody else that it doesn't work for? You're pushing AA as something that's absolute, that's going to help everybody if they get past their ego-driven insanity. What about the people that just have a problem with the whole entire system of AA? Oh, they're selfish, they're self-centered, they're dishonest, they're not, willing. I wished I could tell you who or what God is, but I can't. Oh, but that's not true. I'm sure that you believe that you're supposed to go to meetings in order to stay sober. I'm sure you believe that you're supposed to do prayers in order to stay sober. I'm sure you believe that you're powerless over alcohol and your life is unmanageable and that only a higher power can take away the desire to drink alcohol. That's something I used to see people try to get away with me. They would say, well, I don't even know what God is. But you're claiming you do. You're claiming when you sit in meetings and say you couldn't find a parking space and you got the parking space and you knew it was God, okay? Or when you're saying that you used to be a drunk and now you're not, and that's because of God, then you're telling me what God is. You can't say I don't know what God is and then go to describe what God wants you to do, what principles God likes, you can't do all that and then say, oh, I don't even know what he is. I've researched things I've concerning how the AA program came to be. So you know all about the Oxford group that thanked God for a man like Hitler and that wanted a dictatorship of men in charge of the world that were under God control. You know all about that, right? You researched that part. The thing that had the most influence on me concerning this issue was the book Sermon on the Mount. I'm not going to comment on that really because I never read Sermon on the Mount. I used to see it touted in meetings as some kind of gospel, but I can tell you that some of this stuff, like the Emmett Fox thing and all of that, it came out of something in the late 19th century and the early 20th century called the New Thought movement. And it's not much different than the insanity of the Oxford group. But the New Thought movement, it's been a while since I've looked that up and read about that. But I read about that a long time ago when this guy was touting Emmett Fox in meetings all the time. I would have to look that up and reread it. So I'm going to have to skip this little bit here he goes on about with Emmett Fox because I never read it, Of course, in one way, I could say that I was doing what AA told me to do. I had so many sponsors that said, you just need to read the big book. And I had other sponsors that said the first 164 pages is all you'll ever need. And over and over and over again. And as a matter of fact, now that I've come across this, I'm curious. So I'm going to look up Emmett Fox. I don't know if I'm going to read his whole book or not, but I'm going to look him up and find out what I can. And maybe that'll be the topic for my next video. Who knows? So let's see what else he says. I believe that I practice principles that are as consistent with Christian teaching as well as any Christian I know. So I'm as Christian as any Christian I know. You do know what Christians believe, right? You do know that Christians believe that, Jesus is the Son of God and the only way to God is through him, right? So, I mean, if you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God and the only way to God is through Jesus, then you're not really a Christian. I mean, I work with a guy who's Southern Baptist that we kind of agree not to talk about religion at work, just like we agree not to talk about politics at work. Just like it's funny, I work with people that are almost SJW, and I work with people like this guy and a couple of others that are hardcore conservative to the right, whatever. But nobody wants to get fired. They like their paychecks, so people just know not to get too deeply on the issues. But I know enough about him to know he'd have a thing or two to say about you claiming to be practicing Christian principles without being a Christian. Even in a church like I grew up in, which was the Catholic Church, they would say that if you don't believe in Jesus, now they were big on forgiveness in the Catholic Church and confession, of course, and a lot of other things. They weren't quite as condemning as the Protestants, that I've encountered in my life are. But still, again, you can't really say I'm a Christian without being a Christian. It doesn't really work. I mean, not to mention, because I grew up in a kind of a religious household, I pretty much know the Bible. And I can tell you a lot of things wrong in what you just said throughout this article if I was going to take a Christian perspective. But since I'm not Christian, I'm not going to do that. I find all these principles in most historical philosophies. Oh, you do. Name me a historical philosophy that says you're powerless and you can't run your own life. Or name me a historical philosophy that says all men are selfish and self-centered unless they're brought under God control. That's what the Oxford group taught. That you had to be brought under God control, and Bill W. took from the Oxford group and turned it into AA, and it's the same kind of thing. You're just totally useless without being brought under some kind of God control. But this is, name me some historical philosophies that you're talking about. What philosophy? Oh, he's going to answer me here. I've studied Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, which came 350 years before Christ, and they're not unlike the values of most religions. You do know what Plato talked about, right? You do know what he was talking about in the ideas of rhetoric, when he was talking about the criticism of human behaviors and certain things. You do know that you do understand Plato's teaching, right? It has nothing to do with anything to do with AA whatsoever. There's nothing in Plato's writings that have anything to do with AA and what you're talking about. Okay, as for Socrates, Socrates never wrote a book. You'd have to read Plato to know about Socrates. And now you're talking about Aristotle, which, again, do you really understand what Aristotle wrote and talked about? Because he talked about a lot. And it doesn't have anything to do with these so-called vague, ambiguous principles that you keep claiming that AA has. Just like Christianity doesn't really have anything to do with what AA is preaching. Have you ever gone to an AA meeting where they say, church is for people who are afraid of hell? Yeah, AA is for people who have already been there. Or have you ever gone to an AA meeting and heard that popular slogan, religion is man-made, spirituality is not? Which I used to crack up about that, because what is the AA program if it's not man-made? I mean, do they really think God wrote the AA program? And do they really think that's spirituality? As somebody who has a practice like I have, I mean, I can tell you that's the furthest fucking thing from spirituality that I can even closely define. Spirituality's not saying that I'm useless and weak and I'm an evil person full of sin and character defects and they need to be removed by a higher power in order to survive each day for the rest of my life. That doesn't fit my idea of anything that I would call spirituality. So I don't, and it's unlike the values of most religions. Most religions would be in conflict with AA. I wonder how many church basements know about all the kind of stuff that I used to hear in AA meetings. As a result of all my studies, I've settled in a way of life based on unselfish principles. Unselfish principles. What sort of unselfish principles are we talking about here? I mean, really, AA's so-called principles, it'll say something like honesty or open-mindedness and willingness. None of that's unselfish. And none of it's absolute either. I could get into a long thing. In fact, maybe I'll just have to do a video on that too. About that, that's totally meaningless. What you're talking about. And there's nothing in AA. AA often says it's a selfish program. It's a selfish program, but I'm living on unselfish principles. In one part of the big book, it says you're never supposed to pray for yourself. You're supposed to pray for other people. The other part of the big book tells you how to pray for God to do all these things for you. So in other words, this is just vague stuff, like when they talk about having a life beyond your wildest dreams in AA, which I never felt that anybody I was surrounded by in those meetings had a life beyond their wildest dreams. I don't call sitting around every night talking about what you did when you were drunk, talking about how you're selfish and self-centered, talking about how you're immoral, talking about how, you're full of all these character defects, that God has to take these character defects away from you, and that you have to have a sponsor to report to for the rest of your life and meetings to report to for the rest of your life. I don't call that a life beyond my wildest dreams. Maybe you do. So I'm 22 minutes in, and I guess I pretty much covered all I'm going to cover on this one. So I guess I'll see you guys next time.